The impossible part was not that their ship vanished beneath the Antarctic ice. It was that every man who had sailed aboard her was still expected to come home. On a desolate shore at the edge of the Southern Ocean, a group of exhausted explorers would eventually wait beneath overturned boats, watching an empty horizon for a rescue ship that might never appear. By then, they had lost their original mission, their vessel, most of their equipment, and any reliable connection to the outside world. They had crossed unstable ice, endured months of darkness, and reached lands so remote that no one knew to search there. Yet the story of the Endurance expedition would not become famous because its planned crossing of Antarctica succeeded. It would become famous because the expedition failed almost completely, while the men at its center somehow refused to disappear with it. To understand why their survival seemed impossible, we have to return to 1914, when the dangers still looked manageable, the maps still suggested a path forward, and British explorers believed that discipline, preparation, and courage could overcome one of the last great geographic challenges on Earth. The plan belonged to Sir Ernest Shackleton, an experienced polar explorer whose ambitions had been shaped by the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. The South Pole had already been reached, but Shackleton believed another great objective remained: the first complete crossing of the Antarctic continent. His Imperial Transantarctic expedition would approach from the Weddell Sea, land a crossing party on the continental coast, travel across the interior by way of the South Pole, and continue toward the Ross Sea on the opposite side. A second group would establish supply depots from the far side. On paper, it was a coordinated operation of distance, navigation, manpower, dogs, food, and timing. In reality, the entire design depended on one essential condition that no leader could command. The Weddell Sea had to allow the expedition ship to reach land. Shackleton's vessel was Endurance, a wooden ship built for polar conditions and named after the family motto associated with him: "By endurance we conquer." She was strong, carefully constructed, and intended to withstand heavy ice. But strength against ice did not mean immunity from it. The Weddell Sea was not a motionless white field. Its pack ice moved under the influence of wind, current, temperature, and pressure, opening narrow channels one day and closing them the next. A ship could appear to be progressing through clear water and then find the route behind it sealed by drifting masses of ice. The expedition therefore needed not only a capable leader, but also an exceptional seaman. Captain Frank Worsley, a New Zealander with extensive maritime experience, commanded Endurance. Shackleton carried responsibility for the expedition as a whole. Worsley carried responsibility for the ship, its position, and the decisions required to move through seas that often provided few dependable landmarks. Their partnership would become one of the defining relationships of the journey. Shackleton watched men, morale, and risk. Worsley watched weather, headings, currents, and the changing shape of the ice. Neither man yet knew that the expedition's ultimate survival would depend less on crossing Antarctica than on reading the ocean with extraordinary precision. Endurance departed Britain in August 1914, just as Europe was entering the First World War. Shackleton reportedly offered the ship and crew for national service, but the expedition continued south. The timing added a strange contrast to the voyage. While armies mobilized in Europe, these men sailed toward a region beyond ordinary communication, where news could arrive months late and political events seemed almost unreal. Their world would soon be reduced to weather reports, engine sounds, animal care, ration lists, compass bearings, and the color of the sky above the ice. After traveling through the Atlantic, Endurance reached South Georgia, an island that served as the last practical point of contact before the Weddell Sea. Whaling captains familiar with southern conditions warned that the ice was unusually difficult. This was not a theatrical prediction of disaster. It was the kind of practical knowledge that experienced sailors respected. The pack could extend farther north than expected, and conditions near the Antarctic coast might prevent a clean approach. Shackleton listened, delayed briefly, and then chose to continue. That decision would later be examined as part of the larger debate over the expedition. Was it confidence grounded in experience, Or did ambition push the ship into a season already showing signs of unusual danger? The historical record supports caution in answering. Polar exploration always required leaders to move before certainty was available. Waiting could improve conditions, but it could also consume the limited summer. Turning back might protect the ship, but it would end the expedition before the attempt had truly begun. Shackleton faced the kind of decision that becomes clear only after history reveals the result. On December 5, 1914, Endurance left South Georgia and entered the Southern Ocean routes leading toward the Weddell Sea. The men aboard represented many specialties: sailors, officers, scientists, engineers, physicians, a photographer, and handlers responsible for the dog teams. Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer, would preserve images that later shaped how the world remembered the ordeal. At first, the voyage south still contained the energy of a great undertaking. Equipment had purpose. Every crate belonged to a plan. Dogs would help move supplies across the continent. Scientific instruments would record observations. Clothing, food, fuel, sledges, boats, and tools had been selected for a mission expected to unfold in stages. The crew did not imagine that many of these objects would later be judged by a far more severe question. Could a man carry it across broken ice? And could it help keep him alive? The first encounters with pack ice did not immediately mean disaster. Polar ships often worked through ice by searching for leads, following open water, reversing when passages closed, and waiting when movement became impossible. Endurance pushed onward through a shifting landscape of white pressure ridges, dark water, low cloud, and distant icebergs. Progress was measured not only in miles, but in opportunities. A channel might offer a path for several hours before closing. Wind could compress the pack around the hull or pull it apart enough to permit movement. Worsley and the officers watched the ship's position while Shackleton considered how each delay affected the landing plan. The Antarctic summer was not endless. Every lost day reduced the time available to reach the coast, unload, organize the crossing party, and begin the journey inland. Still, confidence remained. Endurance had been built for these conditions. The crew was experienced. The ship had engines as well as sails. The destination appeared close enough to preserve hope. Then the pack became denser. Open water narrowed. Movement slowed from purposeful navigation to a search for any available route. The expedition was approaching the Antarctic coast, but the sea no longer behaved like a road leading toward land. It behaved like a moving barrier. The ice did not need to strike suddenly to become dangerous. It only needed to close, hold, and drift. On January 19, 1915, Endurance became locked fast in the pack ice of the Weddell Sea, roughly 85 miles from the intended landing area. The ship had not reached the continent, and the men had not begun the crossing for which nearly everything aboard had been prepared. Instead, vessel and crew became passengers within the ice, carried wherever the pack moved. At first, being trapped did not necessarily mean being lost. The men could hope for a change in wind, a shift in current, or a break in the pack. Ships had escaped such conditions before. The expedition still possessed shelter, stores, tools, dogs, leadership, and routines. Endurance remained their home, their transportation, and their strongest defense against the Antarctic environment. But the most important change had already occurred. The mission's direction was no longer controlled from the bridge. Worsley could calculate where they were, but he could not steer through solid ice. Shackleton could organize the men, but he could not order the sea to open. Each day the ship drifted with the pack, and each day the planned landing point became less relevant. The expedition had been designed around forward motion. Now its survival would depend on waiting. Waiting sounds passive, but in Antarctica, it demanded constant work. The ship had to be maintained. Supplies had to be monitored. The dogs required care. Scientific observations continued. Men needed duties, recreation, and a sense that time still had structure. Shackleton understood that isolation could weaken a crew long before hunger did. He watched personalities closely, considered how men responded to uncertainty, and worked to prevent anxiety from becoming division. Worsley continued his observations and records because position remained essential, even when movement could not be controlled. Their skills were already shifting toward a new purpose. Leadership was no longer about reaching the coast on schedule. Navigation was no longer about choosing a course. Both were becoming tools for preserving order inside a prison that moved. The days shortened. The sun sank lower. The Antarctic winter approached, bringing prolonged darkness and colder conditions. Around Endurance, the pack extended beyond the horizon. There was no nearby settlement, no aircraft ready to search, and no radio capable of calling directly for immediate rescue. The outside world did not know that a celebrated expedition had stopped moving. For those aboard, the danger was still measured in possibilities rather than certainties. The ship might be released. The pack might carry them toward open water. The hull might endure until the next season. But beneath those hopes was a reality that grew harder to ignore. Endurance had entered the Weddell Sea to deliver men to Antarctica, and instead the sea had taken possession of the ship. The expedition had not yet lost its vessel. The crew had not yet stepped onto a drifting ice floe with all that remained of their future. The James Caird had not yet faced the Southern Ocean, and Elephant Island was still only a name on a map. But the transformation had begun. A journey intended to conquer distance was becoming a struggle to survive time, and the first great objective was quietly shrinking. They were no longer asking how quickly they could cross Antarctica. They were beginning to ask whether the ice would ever let them go. The men aboard Endurance had entered the Weddell Sea believing that difficulty was part of the mission, not a sign that the mission had already failed. That belief came from the age in which they sailed. During the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, danger was expected to be managed through preparation, endurance, discipline, and judgment. Explorers knew that polar travel could destroy equipment, delay schedules, and force leaders to revise their plans. They also believed that experience could turn uncertainty into progress. Shackleton had already learned how quickly Antarctic ambition could be reduced by weather, distance, and physical limits. Yet those earlier lessons had not diminished his desire to attempt the crossing. They had shaped the way he planned it. The expedition was not intended to be a careless gamble. It was organized as a large and coordinated operation involving two parties, two sides of the continent. Dogs, supply depots, scientific work, and carefully selected personnel. From the beginning, the objective depended on timing. The Weddell Sea party had to reach the coast, establish a base, and begin the continental journey while the season still allowed meaningful travel. The Ross Sea party, operating from the opposite side, would place supplies along the later stages of the planned route. If both sides performed their roles, Shackleton's crossing party would travel from sea to sea through a landscape that remained one of the least forgiving places on Earth. It was a bold plan, but boldness in polar exploration did not mean the absence of method. Every stage had been considered in terms of food, transport, shelter, navigation, and manpower. Endurance was central to that design because the expedition could not begin until the ship carried the men close enough to the Antarctic coast. She had been constructed in Norway for work in polar waters, with a strong wooden hull and a design intended to resist pressure. Her timbers were heavy, her bow was shaped to meet ice, and her internal structure gave the crew confidence that she could survive conditions that would threaten an ordinary vessel. The ship was not invulnerable, but she appeared well suited to the task. That distinction would later become painfully important. A vessel designed to work among ice could still be defeated if the pack closed around it with enough force and for enough time. Before that reality became obvious, however, Endurance represented security. She carried food, clothing, fuel, scientific equipment, dog teams, tools, spare materials, books, instruments, personal possessions, and the 3 lifeboats that seemed secondary while the ship remained sound. She was also a social world. Officers, sailors, scientists, and support staff lived within a hierarchy, but they shared the same wooden structure and the same increasing dependence on one another. Shackleton had selected men not only for technical ability, but also for character. Polar expeditions could place individuals in close quarters for months, where negative personality might damage morale more quickly than a broken tool. He therefore watched how men worked, joked, complained, cooperated, and responded to uncertainty. Captain Frank Worsley approached the voyage from a different but complementary position. His task was to command the ship and understand the environment through observation. The Weddell Sea offered few stable reference points. Coastlines could remain hidden by distance, weather, or ice. Compass behavior in southern latitudes required care. Clouds could block the sun and prevent reliable observations. Drifting pack meant that even a stationary ship was not truly stationary. Worsley and the officers had to determine where Endurance was, where the ice was carrying her, and how changing conditions affected every possibility of escape. Their records would become increasingly important because the expedition's movement was no longer visible as a simple line across a chart. At times, the pack carried the ship in a direction that appeared helpful. At other times, it erased progress and moved the entire expedition farther from the intended coast. The difference between distance traveled and distance controlled became one of the central facts of their situation. During the early weeks of entrapment, the crew still expected a release. They had reasons for hope. Wind could open leads through the pack. Pressure could separate one field of ice from another. Warmer conditions might weaken the surface. A change in current might create enough movement for Endurance to reach navigable water. The men worked whenever opportunity appeared. They watched channels form and disappear. They prepared the engines. They cut or cleared ice where practical. They studied the horizon for signs of open water. Yet the Weddell Sea did not respond to effort in a predictable way. A route that looked promising could close before the ship reached it. A narrow lead could bend away from the desired course. The ship could be surrounded again almost as soon as the engines began to move her. Progress was measured in fragments, and those fragments were never fully secure. The expedition had entered the region expecting difficult navigation, but increasing pack ice changed the meaning of navigation itself. It was no longer a question of selecting the best course through available water. It became a question of whether water would exist at all. While Worsley monitored position and movement, Shackleton began adapting the organization of the expedition to a longer delay. He understood that waiting without purpose could weaken confidence. Men who believed they were temporarily delayed might remain patient, but men who felt forgotten inside an endless white landscape could begin to lose the discipline that survival demanded. Work therefore continued. The ship required maintenance. The dogs needed exercise, feeding, and handling. Scientific observations remained useful. Stores had to be checked. Equipment had to be protected from cold and moisture. Snow and ice accumulated around the vessel and had to be managed. Ordinary tasks became a way of preserving identity. The men were still members of an expedition, not yet castaways. That distinction helped maintain order. Their days included duties, meals, conversation, reading, music, games, and occasions of humor. Such activities were not distractions from survival. They were part of it. Shackleton recognized that morale could not be restored only after it collapsed. It had to be protected in advance. He paid attention to the emotional temperature of the group as closely as the officers watched the weather. If a man became isolated, resentful, or discouraged, the effects could spread. Leadership in those conditions required more than giving commands. It required understanding when to enforce routine, when to encourage recreation, and when to allow men to feel that their situation remained temporary. Outside the ship, the environment grew steadily less forgiving. The days shortened as the Antarctic winter approached. Temperatures fell. Light became limited. The ice around Endurance thickened and shifted into ridges. When separate fields pressed together, they forced blocks upward and downward, creating an uneven world around the hull. The ship that had once sailed through water now stood within a frozen landscape that moved slowly but never truly rested. Pressure could build without warning. The crew heard the sounds of ice working against ice and timber responding to strain. These noises did not always mean immediate danger, but they reminded everyone that the ship's strength was being tested by forces beyond human control. The men could inspect beams, repair damage, and remove ice, but they could not reduce the pressure of an entire frozen sea. At the same time, the expedition's original schedule became impossible. The landing season passed. Even if Endurance were suddenly released, the opportunity to begin the continental crossing as planned had effectively disappeared. Shackleton could not simply move the calendar backward. The expedition would have to remain with the ship until conditions changed, then reconsider what could still be achieved. This was the first major contraction of the mission. The goal had been to cross Antarctica. Now the immediate goal was to preserve the expedition through the winter and recover freedom of movement when the pack opened. That adjustment did not yet feel like surrender. Polar explorers were accustomed to wintering, delay, and changing plans. The men had stores. They had shelter. They had a strong vessel. Many still believed the ship would drift north with the ice and eventually reach water where she could sail again. Yet each calculation, made by Worsley, revealed how little control remained. The pack carried them according to systems that could be observed but not directed. The ship might drift many miles while making no progress towards safety. A favorable movement could be followed by a reversal. Weather observations offer information but not certainty. In the open sea, a captain could respond to a storm by changing course or reducing sail. Inside the pack, even the best decision might have no immediate effect. Worsley's skill therefore became an act of patience as much as navigation. He recorded, estimated, checked, and waited for moments when the information could guide action. The crew's confidence in Endurance remained strong, but that confidence also created a dangerous comfort. As long as the ship stood, they possessed cabins, a galley, storage, tools, and a barrier between themselves and the cold. It was difficult to imagine abandoning such security for tents on the ice. The lifeboats, though essential safety equipment, looked small beside the vastness surrounding them. No rational leader would choose them while the ship remained habitable. Shackleton therefore prepared mentally for possibilities without announcing disaster before it existed. He studied the behavior of the pack, considered the condition of supplies, and watched the hull. Good leadership required him to avoid both panic and denial. If he acted too early, he might expose the men to greater danger. If he waited too long, he could lose the opportunity to save equipment and lives. The correct moment would not arrive with certainty. It would have to be recognized through judgment. As winter deepened, the expedition entered a strange state between failure and survival. They had not reached the continent, yet they had not abandoned the mission. They were not moving, yet they were drifting hundreds of miles with the pack. They were isolated, yet daily life continued with order. They trusted their ship, even as the sounds of pressure reminded them that strength had limits. The environment did not defeat them in a single dramatic instant. It removed choices gradually. First, it slowed their passage. Then it stopped them. Then it carried them away from their intended route. Finally, it forced them to measure success not by distance crossed, but by time endured. The men had entered the Weddell Sea believing that careful leadership and a well-equipped crew could complete a historic journey without becoming trapped. By the end of that first long season, the trap was no longer a possibility. It was their entire world, and the approaching darkness was about to test whether Endurance was merely strong enough to enter the ice or strong enough to survive what the ice intended to do next. By the time the sun began to disappear for longer stretches, life aboard Endurance had settled into a rhythm that looked orderly from the outside and increasingly uncertain from within. The ship was still intact, the stores were still substantial, and the men still had work to do, but the purpose of that work had changed. Every routine now served two goals at once: keeping the expedition functioning and preventing the crew from dwelling too heavily on the fact that their destination was moving farther away. Captain Frank Worsley continued to take observations whenever the weather allowed. A clear horizon, a brief appearance of the sun, or a usable star could provide information about the ship's position, but the calculations no longer guided a course through open water. Instead, they revealed how the entire frozen field was carrying Endurance across the Weddell Sea. The ship's engines could not oppose that movement. Her rudder could not direct it. She was locked into the pack as firmly as if she had been built into the ice itself. Worsley could measure the drift, compare new positions with earlier ones, and estimate the direction and speed of movement, but he could not turn those numbers into control. Each result added another line to the record and another reminder that the expedition was traveling without sailing. Shackleton understood the psychological weight of this better than most. The crew had signed on for danger, hard work, and a great journey across Antarctica, but they had not expected to spend months watching their own plans become irrelevant. He therefore kept the men occupied and preserved the distinctions that made the ship feel like a functioning community. Officers maintained their responsibilities. Sailors handled maintenance and practical labor. Scientists continued their observations. The dog teams were exercised and managed. Meals were served on schedule whenever conditions allowed. Even entertainment had a role. Music, conversation, games, and celebrations gave the passing weeks recognizable shape. Shackleton knew that discipline did not mean constant severity. It meant creating enough structure that uncertainty could not dominate every hour. The ship's routines became a defense against the environment, not because they could weaken the ice, but because they could protect the men from the mental damage of waiting without purpose. Scientific work continued even though the original expedition had stalled. Measurements of temperature, ice conditions, weather, ocean depth, and movement remained valuable. The men responsible for these records worked in a world that rarely offered comfort. Instruments had to be protected from cold and moisture. Observations sometimes required leaving the relative shelter of the ship. The landscape could change in a matter of hours as pressure ridges rose, cracks opened, and snow covered earlier tracks. These tasks also gave meaning to the delay. The expedition might not be advancing toward the continent, but it was still producing knowledge about a region that remained poorly understood. That sense of usefulness helped maintain morale, although it could not hide the growing truth that the crossing itself had become impossible for the current season. The dogs were another major part of daily life. They represented the transportation system plan for the continental journey, but while Endurance remained trapped, they needed food, exercise, shelter, and constant attention. Kennels and runs were established on the ice near the ship when conditions permitted. Handlers worked with the teams, learning their behavior and maintaining their strength. The dogs brought energy and sound to the frozen environment. They also reminded the men of the journey they had expected to make. Each team had been brought south for a purpose that now seemed increasingly distant. Yet Shackleton did not allow their care to become secondary. As long as the future remained uncertain, every useful resource had to be preserved. Food management became more deliberate as the months passed. Endurance had carried supplies for a long expedition, but those stores had been calculated around a different schedule and a different pattern of travel. The men had expected to establish a base, conduct a crossing, and coordinate with the Ross Sea Party. Now, they were consuming provisions while drifting in place. Shackleton and the officers had to think beyond the immediate comfort of the crew. They could not know when the ship would be released, whether the expedition could continue, or whether they might eventually have to leave the vessel. Rations therefore became part of a larger calculation. The expedition also relied on resources available in the polar environment when practical, reducing pressure on stored food. Every decision involved balance. Too much restriction could damage morale and strength. Too little caution could create a crisis later. The goal was not merely to make supplies last, but to maintain the crew's ability to work, think clearly, and respond if conditions suddenly changed. Endurance herself required constant attention. Snow accumulated on decks and around the hull. Ice formed on equipment, rigging, and exposed surfaces. The ship's systems had to be inspected and maintained even though she could not move. Engineers kept machinery ready in case an opening appeared. Sailors watched the pack for leads and signs of changing pressure. When cracks formed in the distance, hope returned quickly. Men could imagine engines starting, lines being handled, and the ship pushing into open water. Yet many openings closed before they could be used. The pack might loosen in one direction while compressing in another. A stretch of dark water could appear close enough to reach, then vanish beneath shifting ice. The Weddell Sea repeatedly offered the appearance of freedom without providing a reliable path to it. This cycle of hope and disappointment became one of the most difficult features of the entrapment. A storm or change-in. Wind could suggest that release was near, but the next observation might show that endurance remained fixed. Worsley's calculations made the situation increasingly clear. The ship was not simply waiting at a single location for the season to change. She was drifting with the pack over considerable distances. Sometimes the movement carried her generally northward, which encouraged the hope that open water might eventually be reached. At other times, the direction shifted and erased that confidence. The intended landing area became less important with each passing week because the ship was no longer positioned to begin the crossing. Even if the ice released her, the expedition would have to reconsider its objectives, timing, and available resources. The men were not yet ready to call the mission a failure, but the original plan had already been overtaken by events. Shackleton avoided making promises he could not control. He did not tell the crew exactly when the ship would be free because no one could know. Instead, he focused attention on what could be done that day. A damaged item could be repaired. A dog team could be exercised. A scientific reading could be completed. A meal could be prepared. Snow could be cleared. Entertainment could be organized. This method reduced the overwhelming scale of the situation. Men did not have to solve the Weddell Sea. They had to complete the next useful task. Shackleton also observed how the officers and crew interacted. In isolation, small disagreements could expand quickly. A careless remark, unequal duty, or repeated complaint could weaken trust. He understood that fairness was not only moral but practical. Men were more likely to accept hardship when they believed it was shared. Officers could not appear protected from every inconvenience while ordinary sailors carried the burden. The expedition's hierarchy remained, but survival required a sense of common purpose. Shackleton's leadership during this period was less dramatic than the decisions that would come later, yet it may have been equally important. He was creating habits of cooperation before the crew faced conditions that would make cooperation essential. Worsley contributed to this stability through his own consistency. Navigation in the pack demanded patience and precision, even when the results could not immediately change anything. He continued to record position, weather, and movement because those details might later determine where the ship emerged, what route remained possible, or how far the crew had drifted. His work also reinforced the idea that their situation could still be understood. The ice was powerful, but was not beyond observation. Numbers could not free endurance, yet they transformed confusion into a record. That distinction mattered. A crew that knows nothing about its movement can feel completely lost. A crew that can estimate its drift retains at least a partial relationship with the world beyond the horizon. As the Antarctic winter deepened, darkness changed the mood aboard the ship. The sun's absence reduced opportunities for reliable navigation observations and removed the natural rhythm of day and night. Artificial light became more important. The ship's interior offered warmth compared with the conditions outside, but it could also feel narrow and enclosed. Men slept, worked, ate, and waited within the same limited spaces. Outside, the frozen sea extended beyond sight. There were no passing ships, no distant lights, and no sign that civilization was aware of their position. The crew had entered the Weddell Sea as part of a celebrated international undertaking. Now they existed inside a private world of timber, snow, dogs, instruments, and moving ice. Still, endurance gave him confidence. Her hull had survived months of pressure. She remained upright and habitable. The men could hear the pack working around her, but the ship had been designed for difficult conditions, and her strength encouraged the belief that she could continue to protect them until spring. This faith was reasonable, yet it depended on a misunderstanding of scale. A strong hull could resist local pressure. It could not negotiate with an entire sea in motion. When great fields of ice pressed together, the force did not arrive as a single impact that could be prepared for and then endured. It could build gradually shift, direction, ease, and return. Timbers bent. Seams changed. The ship moved slightly within the pack. At times she was lifted, at others she was squeezed. Every sound had to be interpreted. Some noises were ordinary signs of a wooden vessel responding to cold. Others suggested that the structure was under increasing strain. The crew listened closely because their shelter was also their most important piece of equipment. The longer Endurance remained trapped, the more every aspect of survival depended on her continuing to hold. By late winter and early spring, the expedition's emotional center had shifted. The men still hoped for open water, but they no longer spoke as though the continental crossing would begin as soon as the ship was released. Too much time had passed. Too many miles of uncontrolled drift separated them from the original schedule. The practical question was becoming what they could do after freedom, not whether the original plan could be restored exactly as designed. Shackleton had not yet abandoned the expedition's larger ambitions, but he was preparing himself to place survival above achievement. That change remained mostly unspoken, because declaring the mission lost before necessity required it could damage morale. Yet his decisions increasingly reflected a leader studying escape rather than progress. Supplies were reviewed with greater care. Lifeboats were inspected. Equipment was considered not only for use aboard Endurance, but for what might be needed if the crew had to live elsewhere. The ship still stood, and no order to abandon her had been given, but the possibility was becoming part of serious planning. The men had started the journey believing that the strongest obstacle would be the crossing of Antarctica itself. They had imagined sledges moving across the interior, teams navigating mountains and crevasses, and supply depots determining whether the final miles could be completed. Instead, the expedition had been stopped before reaching its starting point. Their greatest challenge was not the continent, but the sea that guarded it. Endurance was no longer carrying them toward history. She was being carried by the ice, and every new calculation confirmed that the expedition's future now depended on forces that could be observed, respected, and endured, but never commanded. The Antarctic winter did not arrive as a single dramatic event. It advanced quietly, taking away light a little earlier each day until darkness became the expedition's normal condition. By May 1915, the sun had disappeared below the horizon, leaving Endurance and the surrounding pack ice beneath a long polar night. The crew still marked mornings and evenings by clocks, meals, and assigned duties, but outside the ship there was little natural difference between 1 hour and the next. Lamps glowed in the cabins. Lanterns moved across the deck. Beyond their limited circles of light, the frozen Weddell Sea remained almost completely black. In that darkness, sound became more important. The men heard wind moving across the rigging, dogs shifting in their shelters, boots pressing into hard snow, and the deep grinding of ice fields moving against one another. Some noises faded without consequence. Others traveled through the hull and reminded everyone that the ship was not resting on solid ground. She was surrounded by a landscape that constantly moved, compressed, and changed shape. Pressure ridges appeared when large sections of pack ice pushed together, forcing broken slabs upward into jagged walls. The same pressure could drive ice beneath the surface, where it pressed against the lower part of the hull. Endurance had been built with heavy timbers and a rounded form intended to help her rise when squeezed, but the Weddell Sea did not apply force in a simple or predictable direction. One field might press from the side, while another shifted beneath the ship. The pressure could ease for hours and then return with greater strength. Officers and sailors inspected the vessel repeatedly, listening for unfamiliar changes and watching for signs that the structure was being forced beyond its ordinary limits. The ship remained their strongest protection against the environment, and every man understood that her condition determined the difference between difficult isolation and a far more dangerous existence on the open ice. Captain Frank Worsley continued to maintain the navigational record despite the limited opportunities available to him. The long darkness, heavy cloud, drifting snow, and uncertain horizon made reliable observations difficult. When conditions permitted, he used the instruments available to estimate position and compare it with earlier readings. These calculations confirmed that Endurance was moving even though she remained locked in place. The pack carried the ship along a broad and irregular path, sometimes northward, sometimes east or west, and occasionally in directions that erased earlier progress. The numbers showed movement without freedom. Worsley could identify where they had been carried, but not where the next pressure change would take them. His records, nevertheless, gave the expedition a connection to geography. Without them, the crew might have felt that the ship had vanished into a featureless darkness. With them, Shackleton and the officers could assess the drift, discuss possibilities, and imagine what might happen when the ice eventually opened. The information offered no immediate escape, but it prevented uncertainty from becoming complete ignorance. Shackleton's attention remained fixed on the men as much as on the ship. He understood that months of darkness could magnify every emotional weakness. A minor disagreement in ordinary circumstances might become a lasting resentment when the same individuals lived together in confined spaces with no private retreat and no clear end to their isolation. He therefore maintained routines that gave each day a recognizable form. Duties were assigned and expected to be completed. The ship had to be cleaned, repaired, and monitored. Snow was removed from decks and access points. Stores were checked. Dogs were fed, exercised, and cared for. Scientific observations continued. Meals were prepared at regular times. These tasks kept the expedition practical and prevented the men from thinking of themselves as helpless passengers. Shackleton did not attempt to preserve morale through optimism alone. He could not honestly promise a release date or guarantee that the original mission would continue. Instead, he tried to create confidence through organization. If the ship was clean, the food controlled, the equipment ready, and the men working together, then the expedition still possessed agency, even while the ice controlled its movement. Recreation also became essential. The crew organized games, music, readings, performances, and celebrations whenever possible. Frank Hurley's photography preserved moments of fellowship and the strange beauty of the ship surrounded by ice. Men played cards, told stories, discussed home, and competed in activities designed to break the monotony. On some occasions, they arranged events on the ice or aboard the ship that temporarily transformed their frozen prison into a place of laughter. These moments were not evidence that the danger had disappeared. They were evidence that the crew understood the need to resist despair. Shackleton encouraged such activities because he knew that mental endurance required more than discipline. A man could follow orders and still lose hope. Shared amusement created emotional space between the crew and the threat outside. It reminded them that they remained individuals with humor, skill, memory, and friendship, not merely names on a ration list. The dogs added another layer of routine and responsibility. They required daily care regardless of darkness, cold, or uncertainty. Their handlers built and maintained shelters on the ice, exercised the teams, and managed the personalities within each group. The animals had been intended to pull sledges across the continent, and their continued presence represented both the expedition's original ambition and the possibility that some form of overland travel might still be required. Caring for them gave the men purposeful work and maintained skills that could become essential. At the same time, food for the dogs had to be considered alongside food for the crew. Every resource existed within a calculation that grew more serious as the weeks passed. Endurance had carried extensive provisions, but those stores had been planned for a mission with stages, movement, and expected resupply arrangements. The crew was now consuming food while the expedition remained suspended in the We'll see. Shackleton and the officers therefore reviewed supplies carefully. They had to preserve strength without creating waste. Rations could not be reduced so severely that men became unable to work, but neither could they be distributed as though the delay had no limit. Hunting and other available local resources helped supplement store provisions when conditions allowed. Fuel required similar care. The ship needed heat, light, cooking, and maintenance, yet every unit consumed could not be replaced. Food and fuel planning became a silent measure of time. The calendar might suggest that spring would eventually return, but the stores represented how long the expedition could remain organized if release did not come. The widening gap between ambition and reality became impossible to ignore. When Endurance had left South Georgia, nearly every object aboard belonged to the plan of crossing Antarctica. The dogs, sledges, scientific instruments, clothing, food, and personal equipment had all been selected for movement across the continent. During the winter, many of those same items were judged by a different standard. Could they remain useful if the ship never reached the coast? Could they be carried if the men had to leave the vessel? Which supplies were essential and which existed only because the original mission had assumed a stable base? Shackleton did not announce an abandonment before necessity demanded it, but his thinking had changed. He increasingly evaluated the expedition as a survival system rather than an exploration system. The purpose of leadership was no longer to protect a schedule. It was to preserve options. Worsley's calculations supported that shift. The navigational record showed that Endurance was drifting far from the intended landing area. Even if the ship became free, the season, distance, and condition of the expedition might make the original crossing impractical. The men were no longer delayed at the gateway to their mission. They were being carried away from it. This realization did not arrive equally for everyone or at the same moment. Some continued to imagine a sudden release and a renewed voyage. Others recognized that the expedition they had joined might never begin. Shackleton had to manage both hope and realism. Too much hope could prevent preparation for disaster. Too much realism, expressed too harshly, could damage morale before there was any immediate need. His leadership style therefore relied on controlled information, close observation, and careful timing. He remained visible among the men, shared their routines, and avoided creating the impression that officers possessed a separate world of comfort or knowledge. The hierarchy of the ship remained necessary, but hardship had to feel shared. Fairness became one of the foundations of discipline. The winter also tested relationships within a crew. Different backgrounds, professions, and personalities have been brought together for a journey built around action. Now, those same men were confined within a waiting period that rewarded patience more than boldness. Scientists continued to record the environment because observation was their work. Sailors maintained a ship that could not sail. Engineers kept machinery ready for an opening that might never appear. Dog handlers trained teams for a continental crossing that seemed increasingly remote. Each man had to find meaning in duties whose original purpose had changed. Shackleton helped preserve cohesion by treating useful work as valuable even when its connection to the larger mission was uncertain. A repaired tool, a completed record, or a well-managed dog team strengthened the group's readiness. Nothing practical was dismissed simply because the expedition had stopped moving. As the months passed, pressure ridges grew around Endurance like frozen walls. The ship became part of the surrounding terrain. Snow accumulated against her sides, and paths were established between the vessel, dog shelters, observation points, and working areas. The image could almost suggest permanence, but nothing about the pack was permanent. Cracks opened where solid surfaces had existed. Ridges collapsed or shifted. Large sections moved with little warning. The ship could lean, rise, or settle as the ice changed beneath her. Men working outside remained alert to the behavior of the surface, because familiar ground could become divided by dark water. This instability made the idea of leaving the ship deeply unattractive. Endurance might be strained, but she still provided cabins, storage, warmth, and a strong platform above the ice. Life in tents would mean greater exposure, reduced comfort, and dependence on a surface that could fracture under them. Shackleton, therefore, had every reason to remain aboard as long as the vessel was safe. The difficulty lay in recognizing the moment when staying became more dangerous than leaving. During much of the winter, that moment had not yet arrived. The hull continued to resist the pressure. Repairs and inspections remained possible. The crew lived with concern rather than immediate crisis. But the sounds grew more frequent, and the behavior of the pack became harder to dismiss. Timbers responded under strain. Doors and fittings no longer aligned exactly as before. Seams and structural points demanded closer attention. These are not merely the noises of a ship becoming cold. They suggested that the sea was testing every part of her construction. Endurance had been designed to survive among ice, but she was now held within it for month after month, unable to move away from the forces building around her. Spring would bring returning light, but not necessarily relief. Warmer conditions could weaken and open the pack, yet changing temperatures could also increase movement and pressure. The same seasonal transition that offered hope could place the ship in greater danger. By the time daylight began to return, the expedition had survived the darkness with its discipline intact. The men had maintained their duties, cared for one another, protected supplies, recorded their drift, and preserved a remarkable degree of morale. Yet endurance through winter had not restored the original plan. It had only carried them deeper into a new reality. The continental crossing had become a distant ambition. The ship had become a threatened refuge, and the Weddell Sea remained in control of their direction. They had successfully survived the waiting, but the pressure gathering around Endurance was preparing to make waiting impossible. The return of daylight did not bring the freedom the expedition had hoped for. Instead, it revealed more clearly how completely Endurance had become part of the frozen Weddell Sea. The pack shifted around her in immense, moving fields, and each change in wind or current altered the pressure on the hull. At times, the ice loosened enough to suggest that open water might soon appear. Then the movement reversed, closing channels and forcing ridges upward around the ship. The crew had spent months listening to the timbers answer the strain, but during October 1915, the character of those sounds changed. The pressure was no longer something Endurance merely endured. It was beginning to reshape her. Floors lifted, doors shifted out of alignment, and internal structures moved under forces that could not be stopped by repair work. The men continued pumping, inspecting, strengthening, and clearing what they could, yet the ship was being compressed by an environment far larger than any structure built by human hands. Captain Frank Worsley and the officers monitored the damage while Sir Ernest Shackleton faced the decision he had been preparing for throughout the winter. Remaining aboard had always been safer than living on exposed ice, but that calculation was changing. Endurance still offered shelter, food storage, equipment, and a familiar system of command. Leaving her would mean transferring the expedition onto a surface that drifted, cracked, and could not be trusted. Yet staying too long could prevent the crew from saving the boats and supplies they would need afterward. Shackleton could not wait for perfect certainty because perfect certainty would arrive only when there was no longer time to act. On October 27th, 1915, he gave the order to abandon ship. The moment ended the expedition as it had originally been conceived. The men had sailed south to begin a crossing of Antarctica. They now stepped onto the ice without having reached the intended starting point, carrying what they could from a vessel that had served as their home for nearly a year. The transition was practical rather than ceremonial. Lifeboats, tents, food, clothing, navigation instruments, cooking equipment, tools, medical supplies, and other essentials had to be moved from the ship to the surrounding pack. Every object was evaluated according to weight and usefulness. The crew could no longer preserve the full world they had built aboard Endurance. They had to reduce it to what could be hauled, protected, rationed, and used in the open. The 3 lifeboats became the most important pieces of equipment they possessed. While the ship remained habitable, the boats had seemed like emergency tools. Now, they represented the only possible means of crossing open water if the pack eventually broke apart. Without them, the men might drift until the ice carried them into conditions they could not survive. Saving the boats therefore became as important as saving food. Moving them, however, required coordinated effort across a surface broken by ridges, soft snow, and uneven blocks of ice. The men used sledges, ropes, and their own strength to transfer equipment away from the damaged vessel. Progress was slow, and every unnecessary pound increased the difficulty. Shackleton imposed strict limits on personal possessions because the group could not afford to carry objects that served memory, but not survival. The decision was emotionally severe, but the reasoning was clear. The expedition's remaining resources had to serve 28 men, and every man had to remain capable of moving with the group. Shackleton's responsibility had changed completely. He was no longer measuring success by geographic achievement, scientific reputation, or the completion of a continental route. From that day forward, his mission was to bring every member of the Endurance Party home. The shift did not require a public declaration. It appeared in the priorities he established. Boats came before comfort. Food came before personal property. Group discipline came before individual preference. Decisions that might preserve strength weeks later mattered more than temporary relief. He continued to watch morale because abandoning the ship could have been interpreted as the final proof that the expedition had failed. Shackleton needed the crew to understand a different reality. The plan had failed, but the group had not. They still possessed leadership, skills, equipment, food, and the ability to cooperate. As long as those elements remained intact, the loss of the original objective did not have to become the loss of the men. Communication with the outside world was impossible. There was no radio connection capable of sending their position to a rescue authority, and no nearby settlement knew their exact circumstances. The war in Europe continued. Ships moved through distant oceans, and families waited for news, but the Endurance Party existed beyond immediate reach. No rescue vessel was already sailing toward them. No aircraft could search the vast pack. The men understood that survival would depend first on their own decisions and later on reaching a place from which help could be found. That reality made Worsley's navigational records even more important. The ship's position, the direction of drift, and the location of possible land had to be understood as accurately as conditions allowed. The crew could not control the ice, but they could still estimate where it was carrying them and prepare for the opportunities that movement might eventually create. After leaving Endurance, the men established a temporary camp on the pack. The first ambition was not simply to remain near the ship. Shackleton considered whether the party could travel across the ice toward land, hauling the lifeboats and supplies behind them. Powlett Island, where provisions from an earlier expedition were believed to remain, represented a possible destination, but it lay many miles away across terrain that did not behave like a continuous road. The crew began moving, only to discover how difficult overland travel would be. The boats were heavy, the snow was soft, and pressure ridges turned short distances into exhausting obstacles. The surface beneath them was also drifting, which meant that even determined effort might produce little real progress toward safety. Men could spend hours hauling equipment, while the pack carried the entire camp in another direction. The expedition had planned to cross a continent with prepared sledges and dog teams. It was now trying to move boats across unstable sea ice under conditions for which no original schedule had been designed. Shackleton recognized that continued marching could consume strength without delivering enough distance to justify the cost. He halted the attempt and established a more stable position that became known as Ocean Camp. The name reflected the truth beneath their feet. Although tents and supplies stood on what appeared to be solid white ground, the camp rested on frozen ocean. It moved day and night with the pack, carrying the men across the Weddell Sea without their consent. Ocean Camp was safer than a constant struggle over pressure ridges, but it was not secure in any permanent sense. Cracks could open near tents. The ice could compress or separate. The camp had to be organized so that the boats and essential supplies could be reached quickly if the flow became unsafe. The crew arranged tents, cooking areas, equipment, and provisions with the understanding that everything might need to be moved again. Life aboard Endurance had been confined, but it had offered walls, bunks, storage rooms, and a galley. Life at Ocean Camp reduced existence to canvas, sleeping bags, ration boxes, cooking stoves, clothing, and the condition of the ice. Cold entered every routine. Snow had to be managed. Water had to be produced. Food had to be protected and distributed. Dampness became difficult to escape. The men slept close together and depended on one another for the smallest practical tasks. Shackleton preserved the command structure, but he also reinforced the principle that hardship would be shared. Officers and sailors lived within the same exposed system. No rank could create warmth where none existed. Work assignments, rationing, and camp discipline had to appear fair because resentment in such close conditions could weaken the entire group. The dogs remained part of camp life, requiring care and food, while also representing potential labor. The men continued scientific and navigational observations when possible, not because the continental crossing remained alive, but because information could shape their next decision. Worsley studied the drift and tried to understand whether the pack might carry them toward a position where open water and navigable routes became available. Each observation connected Ocean Camp to the map, even when the camp itself had no fixed location. The emotional link to Endurance had not yet been completely severed. The damaged ship remained visible from camp, and parties returned when conditions permitted to recover supplies and equipment. Frank Hulley worked to preserve a selection of photographic material, understanding that much of the expedition's visual record could not be carried. Other men retrieved food, timber, tools, clothing, and items that might improve the boats or camp. The ship had become both a threatened structure and a storehouse from which the future had to be salvaged piece by piece. Each return carried practical value, but it also forced the men to confront what was being lost. Endurance had represented ambition, safety, national pride, and the possibility of returning under sail. Now she stood damaged within the ice while the expedition lived outside her. The crew watched as the pack continued its work. The vessel settled lower, her form altered by pressure, and the distance between ship and camp became emotional as well as physical. On November 21st, 1915, Endurance finally disappeared beneath the ice and water of the Weddell Sea. Worsley recorded the loss, preserving the event in the expedition's history, while the men at Ocean Camp faced a horizon from which their most recognizable connection to civilization had vanished. There was no dramatic rescue waiting beyond that moment. The ship's disappearance did not open the sea, create a route to land, or reveal a solution. It simply removed the possibility that Endurance might somehow recover and carry them north. The crew was now fully dependent on the drifting flow, the 3 lifeboats, their remaining supplies, and the decisions of their leaders. Shackleton could no longer plan around the survival of the vessel. Every future option began with the same fact. 28 men were living on moving ice with no way to summon help. Yet the loss of Endurance also clarified the mission. There was no longer a continental crossing to preserve, no ship to repair, and no schedule to restore. The expedition had contracted to its most human form. Keep the group together. Protect the boats. Preserve strength. Follow the drift. Wait for a navigable opening. Reach land. Find rescue. Return for anyone separated along the way. Shackleton had begun the journey hoping to lead men across Antarctica. He now faced a more uncertain responsibility, leading them through a sequence of decisions for which no complete map existed. Behind them, the ship was gone. Beneath them, the world continued to move. Ocean Camp gave the men a place to stop moving, but it did not give them a place to belong. Their tents stood on a drifting floe that could carry them north, turn them east, or break apart beneath them without warning. Beneath several feet of ice lay the Weddell Sea, and beyond the camp stretched a white horizon that offered no road, no permanent landmark, and no promise that land was becoming closer. Shackleton understood that the camp could survive only if the men treated it as an organized station rather than a temporary gathering of exhausted castaways. The lifeboats were placed where they could be reached quickly. Food was stacked and guarded from weather. Cooking areas were arranged to reduce waste. Watches were maintained. Equipment was checked repeatedly. Every object had a location, because confusion during a sudden crack or pressure movement could cost precious time. Routine became the framework holding the expedition together. The men rose, worked, ate, repaired clothing, cared for equipment, and prepared for changes they could not predict. There was no room for disorder because the surface beneath them was already unstable enough. Life in the tents was far more difficult than life aboard Endurance had been. The ship had offered cabins, walls, bunks, shelves, and a galley. Ocean Camp offered canvas shelters pressed by wind and surrounded by snow. Sleeping bags absorbed moisture and became difficult to dry. Clothing remained damp from labor, weather, and the constant struggle to create warmth. Men slept close together, sharing limited space and listening to the sounds outside. A change in the wind could shake the tents. A distant pressure movement could produce a deep sound through the ice. At times, cracks opened close enough to force immediate attention. The men learned to recognize that the white surface was not silent and not still. It shifted, settled, groaned, and divided. What appeared safe at one moment could become uncertain during the next watch. Shackleton insisted that the group remain ready to move, but readiness had to be balanced against the need to conserve strength. The earlier attempt to haul boats and supplies across the pack had demonstrated how quickly hard labor could be wasted. Soft snow, pressure ridges, and uneven ice turned every short distance into a major effort. The men could exhaust themselves while the entire flow drifted in the opposite direction. Shackleton therefore rejected movement for its own sake. He would not allow the crew to spend strength merely to feel active. Every major effort had to offer a realistic advantage. This was one of the central qualities of his leadership during the months on the ice. He understood that courage without judgment could be destructive. The men did not need dramatic gestures. They needed disciplined decisions made with incomplete information. Frank Worsley continued to provide the best information available. Whenever the weather allowed, he took observations and calculated the camp's changing position. The numbers revealed a strange journey. The expedition was moving across the Weddell Sea, sometimes covering many miles, yet none of the men controlled the direction. A favorable drift toward open water could raise morale. A reversal could erase that hope. Worsley's calculations were not perfect because cloud, uncertain horizons, and the motion of the ice limited his opportunities, but they were essential. Shackleton used them to judge whether the flow might carry the party toward possible escape routes. The men listened for news of their position because geography had become a form of emotional weather. A reading that suggested northward progress could lift the camp. A reading that showed little improvement could deepen the sense of confinement. Worsley therefore carried not only a technical responsibility, but also the burden of translating an invisible movement into something the crew could understand. Food control became increasingly strict. The supplies recovered from Endurance were limited, and the group could not know how long it would remain on the ice. Shackleton and the officers had to plan for a future that might include months of drifting, a dangerous boat journey, or both. Rations were distributed carefully, with attention to the physical demands placed on the men. Hunger could weaken concentration, reduce resistance to cold, and damage morale, but generous consumption in the present could create a far more serious shortage later. The expedition supplemented its stores when the environment provided opportunities, yet nothing could be assumed. Every meal represented a decision about tomorrow. Cooking required fuel, and fuel also had to be preserved. Snow could be melted for water, but even that simple necessity demanded time, equipment, and heat. Survival depended on hundreds of repeated calculations that would never appear as heroic moments. How much food could be used? How dry was the clothing? Which equipment needed repair first? How close was the nearest crack? Was the flow stable enough for another night? Shackleton maintained fairness because unfairness could destroy cooperation. The men watched how food was divided, how duties were assigned, and how hardship was shared. Rank still mattered for command, but it could not become a shield from discomfort. Officers and sailors endured the same cold, slept in the same poor conditions, and depended on the same ration system. Shackleton knew that men were more likely to accept difficult orders when they believed their leader understood the cost. He remained visible, observed individual behavior, and paid attention to signs of discouragement. A person who became withdrawn or resentful could affect an entire tent. Small conflicts could grow under pressure. Shackleton therefore arranged relationships as carefully as he arranged supplies. Men who might strengthen one another were placed together. Personalities that could create friction were managed through duty, proximity, and supervision. The goal was not to create perfect harmony. It was to prevent frustration from becoming division. Humor remained one of the expedition's strongest protections. The men joked about meals, weather, clothing, and the absurdity of living on a piece of frozen ocean. They created nicknames, told stories, argued over small matters, and found entertainment in situations that offered little comfort. Humor did not mean they misunderstood the danger. It meant they refused to allow danger to define every conversation. Shared laughter reminded them that they still possessed control over their reactions, even when they possessed little control over their surroundings. Games and informal competitions continued when practical. Reading and conversation helped pass long periods of waiting. Memories of home circulated through the tents. Men discussed food they could not eat, places they could not visit, and ordinary comforts that had once seemed unimportant. These conversations could produce longing, but they also reinforced the idea that a world beyond the ice still existed. Psychological discipline was as necessary as physical endurance. Panic would not open the sea. Despair would not improve the drift. The men had to remain emotionally prepared for an opportunity that might appear suddenly after weeks of monotony. Ocean camp eventually proved unsuitable for a long stay. The flow changed, and the expedition's position continued to drift. Shackleton again considered movement, but the same obstacles remained. Hauling the boats over broken ice consumed enormous energy. After another limited effort, he chose to establish a new camp on a stronger flow. This became Patience Camp, a name that described both the strategy and the burden placed on the men. They would wait for the pack to carry them farther north and for the ice to break enough to launch the lifeboats. The decision was difficult because waiting could feel like surrendering initiative. Yet Shackleton recognized that the ice was performing movement they could not achieve efficiently on foot. Their task was to remain alive, organized, and ready while the flow transported them toward a region where open water might become possible. Patience Camp was not more comfortable in any meaningful sense. The tents remained exposed. Sleeping bags remained damp. Clothing grew worn and stiff. The men's bodies carried the effects of prolonged cold, restricted food, and limited rest. Their beards lengthened, faces became leaner, and ordinary movements required greater care. The camp surface was increasingly uneven. Pressure ridges surrounded some areas, while cracks formed in others. The boats had to remain close because the flow could not be trusted indefinitely. Watches were especially important during the night. A man responsible for observing the ice had to remain alert, even when fatigue made concentration difficult. The safety of the entire camp could depend on noticing a widening crack or a change in pressure early enough to move equipment. The crew also had to accept that some resources could not be preserved forever. Equipment deteriorated. Clothing could be repaired only so many times. Fuel and food continued to decline. The dog teams, once central to the transcontinental plan, became part of increasingly painful logistical decisions as the expedition's circumstances narrowed. Shackleton's guiding principle remained the survival of the men. Every choice had to be judged by that objective, even when it meant giving up another connection to the original mission. The continental crossing had long since disappeared from practical discussion. The expedition no longer measured progress towards scientific or geographic achievement. Success meant maintaining the group until the boats could be used. Worsley's navigation suggested that they were drifting generally toward the northern edge of the pack, but the path was irregular and uncertain. Land appeared on maps as possible refuge. Yet the distance between a charted island and a drifting camp could change with wind and current. Powlett Island, Snow Hill Island, and other potential destinations entered discussions, but none offered a simple route. The flow might carry them near one possibility and then move away. Even if land lay within a manageable distance, the surface between the camp and that land might be impossible to cross with 3 heavy boats. The men therefore lived inside a contradiction. They needed the ice because it held their camp above the sea, but they also needed it to break apart so the boats could move. If the flow remained solid too long, supplies could run dangerously low. If it shattered too quickly, the crew might be forced into the boats before conditions were suitable. Patience was not passive. It required constant observation, restraint, and readiness. Shackleton maintained control by refusing to let uncertainty produce conflicting actions. The crew did not march simply because they were tired of waiting. They did not launch boats into unusable water simply because the camp was uncomfortable. Decisions were delayed until conditions provided a real chance of improvement. This restraint protected strength and reduced unnecessary risk, but it also demanded trust. The men had to believe that their leaders were waiting for a reason, not because they lacked a plan. Shackleton supported that trust through visibility, fairness, and consistency. Worsley supported it through measurements that showed the camp's movement was being tracked. Together, they transformed waiting into a strategy. As the weeks passed, the flow carried Patience Camp toward more unstable ice. Open water appeared more frequently. Leads widened and closed. The surface beneath the tents became less dependable, and the sound of movement increased. Men began sleeping with the awareness that an order to move might come suddenly. The boats were prepared. Supplies were arranged for rapid loading. Personal belongings had already been reduced to the minimum. Every remaining item had to justify its place. The expedition had survived because it had preserved organization while its world steadily contracted. First, the men had lost the continental crossing. Then they had lost endurance. Then they had lost the idea that the ice could serve as a stable home. Now the flow itself was approaching its final limit. The same sea that had held them prisoner for more than a year was beginning to open, and when it did, 28 men would have to leave the relative security of the ice and trust their future to 3 small boats. The moment Patience Camp had been waiting for arrived without offering anything that resembled safety. The ice beneath the expedition began to weaken, crack, and separate into smaller sections, opening dark channels of water between the flows. For months, the men had depended on the ice to support their tents, boats, food, and remaining equipment. Now that same surface was becoming too unstable to trust. Shackleton understood that delaying much longer could leave the party divided across fragments of drifting ice, unable to keep the lifeboats and supplies together. On April 9, 1916, he ordered the men into the 3 boats they had protected since abandoning Endurance: the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. The transition from camp to open water was not a release from danger. It was an exchange of one uncertain world for another. The flow had been unstable, but it had provided enough space for tents and limited movement. The boats were crowded, low in the water, and exposed to wind, spray, cold, and the constant movement of the sea. 28 men, their food, navigation instruments, sleeping equipment, and essential supplies had to be divided carefully among the 3 small vessels. Shackleton coordinated the group while Worsley and the other officers managed navigation and boat handling. Their survival now depended on remaining close enough to support one another without allowing the boats to collide in broken ice or rough water. The sea around them was filled with fragments of the pack, and passages that appeared open could narrow quickly as wind and current moved the ice. Progress demanded constant observation. A boat might be directed toward clear water only to find a route closing ahead. Men had to row, sail, steer, bail water, manage lines, and protect the limited supplies while their clothing and sleeping gear became increasingly damp. Rest was difficult because every position in the boats was crowded and exposed. The crew had survived the long drift through routine and patience, but the boat journey demanded immediate physical effort from men whose strength had already been reduced by months of cold, restricted food, and interrupted sleep. Shackleton could not allow exhaustion to become disorder. He maintained a clear command structure, rotated duties when possible, and watched the condition of each man. Decisions about direction had to account for wind, current, ice, and the condition of the boats. The nearest apparent destination was not always the destination they could reach. Several possible islands existed on the charts, but the expedition had no engine, no outside assistance, and no margin for a major navigational error. Worsley's work became central. From the low and moving boats, he had to estimate position under skies that often prevented dependable observations. The horizon could be obscured by cloud, spray, snow, or ice. Even when a brief view of the sun became available, the boat's movement made the use of instruments difficult. His calculations were therefore based on limited opportunities supported by experience, dead reckoning, and close attention to the behavior of wind and sea. Shackleton relied on those estimates while also judging the physical condition of the crew. A theoretically ideal destination was useless if the men could not survive the journey required to reach it. The boats moved through a world that denied comfort and certainty. At times, the men found temporary shelter on a floe and attempted to rest. Yet the ice could shift or break, forcing them back into the boats. At other times, they remained on the water for long periods because no suitable surface appeared. Meals were limited and difficult to prepare. Drinking water required careful management. The men had to protect their hands, faces, clothing, and equipment from the constant cold. Exposure is often described through temperature alone, but their difficulty came from the combination of wind, wet clothing, cramped positions, fatigue, and the inability to find sustained shelter. Shackleton understood that the group's mental state was becoming as important as its physical strength. He prevented complaints from turning into conflict, gave instructions with confidence, and kept attention focused on the next achievable goal. The crew did not need to solve the entire journey at once. They needed to hold the boats together, reach the next stretch of open water, survive the next period of rest, and continue toward land. After several exhausting days, Elephant Island became their best realistic hope. It was remote, mountainous, and outside ordinary shipping routes, but it offered something the men had not possessed since before endurance entered the pack: solid ground. Worsley's estimates and the officers' coordination guided the boats toward the island despite difficult conditions. On April 15th, the expedition reached a landing place at Cape Valentine. For the first time in nearly 500 days, the men stood on land that was not drifting beneath them. The achievement brought relief, but the location was poorly suited for a long camp. It offered limited protection and raised concerns about the boats, tides, and access to resources. Shackleton, therefore, sent a small party to examine the coast for a better position. 2 days later, the group relocated to a more protected site that would become known as Point Wild, named for Frank Wild, Shackleton's experienced second-in-command. Elephant Island ended the immediate danger of the breaking floes, but did not solve the expedition's larger problem. No settlement existed there. No telegraph station could send news. No regular vessel was expected to pass close enough to notice a small camp on the shore. The outside world did not know that the Endurance Party had reached the island, and no search operation possessed their exact location. The men could create shelter, organize food, and wait, but waiting without a means of attracting rescue could become an indefinite sentence. Shackleton and his officers therefore faced another contraction of the mission. Their objective was no longer to reach land. They had reached it. The new objective was to reach the human world beyond it. The conditions on Elephant Island made the urgency clear. The men had survived the boat journey, but many were exhausted, and their equipment had suffered from prolonged exposure. Clothing and sleeping bags were damp. Food remained limited. The camp needed to be established using the materials available, including the remaining boats. Frank Wild, began organizing the shore party, maintaining discipline and creating a shelter that could protect the men as well as possible. Shackleton, Worsley, and the other officers studied the charts and considered the available destinations. The Antarctic Peninsula lay closer in one direction, while the Falkland Islands and other possibilities existed farther away. Yet wind and current made distance alone a poor guide. South Georgia, the island Endurance had left in December 1914, lay roughly 800 miles across the Southern Ocean. It was a far longer journey, but it contained whaling stations, ships, supplies, and people capable of organizing a rescue. It also lay generally in a direction that the prevailing winds could support. Reaching it would require navigating a small open boat across one of the most unpredictable stretches of ocean on Earth. Missing the island could leave the boat with no practical destination and little hope of recovery. The proposal, therefore, demanded more than courage. It required confidence in the boat, the crew, and Worsley's ability to find a comparatively small island after many days at sea. Shackleton evaluated the alternatives in terms of rescue responsibility. Remaining on Elephant Island kept the group together, but offered no reliable path to discovery. Sending a boat toward a closer but less useful destination might reduce the initial distance while failing to produce help. South Georgia offered the clearest connection to civilization, but reaching it would divide the expedition. A small party would take one of the best boats and some of the most experienced men, while the majority remained behind under Frank Wild's leadership. If the voyage failed, the 22 men on Elephant Island might never know what had happened, and no one would be carrying news of their location toward the outside world. Shackleton's responsibility therefore operated in two directions. He had to protect those who would sail, and he had to leave the shore party with leadership, shelter, supplies, and the belief that rescue would come. The James Caird was selected for the attempt because she was the strongest and largest of the three boats. Even so, she had not been designed for an 800-mile ocean passage under such conditions. The carpenter, Harry McNish, worked to strengthen and modify her using the limited materials available. The sides were raised, a makeshift deck was constructed, and the boat was prepared to carry provisions, water, ballast, navigation instruments, and 6 men. Every alteration represented an effort to transform an open lifeboat into a vessel capable of surviving the Southern Ocean. Nothing could make the journey safe, but careful preparation could make it possible. Shackleton selected Worsley because navigation would determine whether the boat found South Georgia or passed into empty ocean. Tom Crean joined them as one of the expedition's most experienced and dependable men. McNish's practical skill remained important to the boat's survival, while Timothy McCarthy and John Vincent completed the party. Frank Wild would command the 22 men left on Elephant Island. Shackleton instructed him to maintain discipline and preserve hope, understanding that the waiting group might have no contact with the sailing party for weeks or months. Wild's task would be different from Shackleton's, but no less demanding. He would have to keep the camp functioning without knowing whether the James Caird had reached its destination. On April 24, 1916, the 6 men launched the boat from Elephant Island. Those remaining on shore watched as their most direct connection to rescue moved away across the gray water. There was no guarantee that the small sail would ever return, and no way to communicate once it disappeared beyond the horizon. The expedition had now been divided into 2 survival stories. On Elephant Island, 22 men would wait beneath an improvised shelter, trusting Frank Wild to maintain order and Shackleton to keep his promise. In the James Caird, 6 men would cross the Southern Ocean carrying a sextant, a chronometer, limited supplies, and the location of everyone left behind. Reaching land had not ended the crisis. It had only created the possibility of rescue, and that possibility now depended on whether Worsley could find a distant island from the deck of a small boat, while Shackleton kept its crew alive long enough to reach it. The James Caird left Elephant Island carrying 6 men, limited supplies, and the only known path between 22 stranded explorers and the outside world. It carried the only known path between 22 stranded explorers and the outside world. Once the small boat disappeared beyond the horizon, the Endurance expedition became divided by roughly 800 miles of the Southern Ocean, with no radio, no scheduled contact, and no certainty that either group would ever learn what happened to the other. The men remaining at Point Wild placed their confidence in Frank Wild, who maintained the camp and reinforced Shackleton's promise that rescue would come. The 6 men aboard the James Caird placed their confidence in the strength of a modified lifeboat, the judgment of Sir Ernest Shackleton, and the navigation of Captain Frank Worsley. The entire chain of survival now depended on each part working. If the boat failed, no one would know the location of the men on Elephant Island. If Worsley missed South Georgia, the James Caird could continue into open ocean with no practical destination. If the shore party lost organization, a successful voyage might still arrive too late. This was why the survival mission had become so improbable. The crew had not been trapped because of one careless mistake or a single sudden storm. Endurance had entered the Weddell Sea during a season of unusually difficult pack ice and had been closed in before reaching the intended landing point. Once locked into the frozen sea, the ship became part of a vast moving system controlled by wind, current, and pressure. The expedition could observe the drift, but it could not direct it. Months of compression damaged the vessel beyond recovery, forcing the men onto ice that was itself moving and breaking apart. Every later decision followed from that original entrapment. The loss of the ship created Ocean Camp. The instability of the flows created Patience Camp. The breaking pack forced the lifeboat journey. Elephant Island provided land, but no communication. The James Caird voyage became necessary because no rescue organization knew where to look. What had begun as an effort to cross Antarctica had contracted step by step into a single responsibility: reach help and return for the men left behind. The James Caird was small for the ocean it had to cross. Harry McNish had strengthened her sides and built a rough covering over part of the boat, but the modifications could not create the protection of a full-sized vessel. The 6 men lived and worked in extremely confined conditions. Water entered despite their efforts, clothing remained damp, and ice accumulated on exposed surfaces. Ballast helped stabilize the boat, while food, water, navigation instruments, and limited personal equipment occupied what little space remained. The men could not all rest comfortably at the same time. Duties had to continue regardless of exhaustion. Sails required attention, water had to be removed, equipment had to be protected, and the boat's condition had to be monitored. Cooperation was not an inspiring idea added later by historians. It was a daily mechanical requirement. One man failing to perform a task could increase the burden on everyone else. Shackleton organized the watches and judged the condition of the crew. Worsley waited for opportunities to determine their position. The Southern Ocean rarely provided ideal conditions for navigation. Cloud covered the sky, the horizon became uncertain, and the boat rose and fell constantly. A sextant reading demanded a visible sun and a reliable relationship between the sky and the horizon. Worsley sometimes received only brief opportunities to take observations. A single opening in the clouds could carry enormous importance. He combined those readings with dead reckoning, estimates of speed, direction, current, and the boat's movement since the previous calculation. The margin for error was narrow because South Georgia was a relatively small target within a vast ocean. Sailing slightly too far north or south could mean passing beyond sight of the island. The men did not possess unlimited water or provisions for another attempt. Later observers would describe the voyage with astonishment because it required navigation that was both technically precise and performed under conditions that repeatedly interfered with precision. Worsley did not guide the boat through calm water from a stable deck. He worked from a lifeboat surrounded by cold spray, shifting seas, limited visibility, and physically exhausted companions. His skill gave Shackleton something essential: a credible destination rather than a hopeful direction. Leadership and navigation reinforced one another. Worsley could calculate a course, but but the men had to remain capable of following it. Shackleton could maintain discipline, but discipline alone could not locate an island beyond the horizon. The crew members who repaired equipment, handled sails, baled water, prepared food, and endured their watches made the calculations meaningful. Survival came from the interaction of these abilities, not from one heroic quality operating alone. After more than 2 weeks at sea, signs suggested that land might be near. Birds appeared, vegetation was seen in the water, and the character of the environment began to change. On May 10, 1916, the James Caird reached South Georgia. The achievement answered only part of the problem. Severe weather and the condition of the boat had forced the men toward the island's uninhabited southern coast. The whaling stations and people capable of helping them were on the northern side. Sailing around the island remained dangerous, and the small party could not simply wait for another ship to discover them. Shackleton therefore faced another decision in which reaching land did not mean reaching safety. Some of the men were too exhausted to continue across the interior, while the island's mountains, glaciers, and valleys had not been mapped in enough detail to offer a reliable route. Yet the settlement at Stromness lay beyond those barriers, and reaching it was the fastest way to begin a rescue. Shackleton chose Worsley and Tom Crean to accompany him. The other 3 men remained near the boat under the best shelter the group could establish. The 3 travelers began the crossing with limited equipment and no complete knowledge of the terrain. They did not have the supplies for a long expedition into the mountains, which meant they had to keep moving and choose routes quickly. Each ridge revealed another slope, valley, or frozen obstacle. Turning back would consume time and leave the Elephant Island party waiting without help. At several points, the men had to assess the landscape from above and decide whether a descent would lead toward the northern coast or into a route they could not escape. Worsley's ability to interpret direction remained important even away from the sea, while Shackleton balanced speed against the condition of the group. Crean contributed the strength, experience, and reliability that had made him valuable throughout the expedition. Their crossing became essential because the successful ocean voyage had placed them on the wrong side of the final barrier. Without reaching the whaling stations, they possessed no vessel, no communication system, and no means of organizing a rescue. On May 20th, after approximately 36 hours of near-continuous travel, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean reached Stromness. The arrival connected the Endurance party to the human world for the first time since the ship had entered the ice. The men at the station could provide food, shelter, communication, and ships, but Shackleton's responsibility was not complete. 3 members of the James Caird party still waited on the opposite coast, and 22 others remained at Elephant Island. The first local rescue recovered the men left near the boat. The greater challenge was returning through Antarctic waters to Point Wild. Shackleton attempted to reach Elephant Island as soon as possible, but sea ice repeatedly blocked the available vessels. The first effort aboard the Southern Sky could not force a passage through the pack. Another attempt using a vessel supplied through Uruguay also failed to reach the island. A third attempt aboard the Emma encountered mechanical and weather difficulties. Each failure extended the uncertainty for the men waiting at Point Wild. Shackleton knew they had limited resources, but he could not communicate with them, explain the delays, or confirm that they remain alive. The rescue attempts were required because the same ice that had trapped Endurance continued to control access to the region. Finding help had not removed the environmental barrier. It had only provided ships with which to challenge it. On Elephant Island, Frank Wild maintained a shore party through the long wait. The men had created shelter using the remaining boats and available materials. Food was managed carefully, clothing was repaired, watches continued, and routines were preserved. Wild repeatedly encouraged readiness, reportedly keeping the men prepared for the possibility that rescue might appear. His leadership prevented uncertainty from becoming abandonment in the minds of the group. They did not know that Shackleton had reached South Georgia. They did not know that several ships had already tried and failed to reach them. They could only maintain the camp and watch the sea. Their survival, therefore, depended on psychological discipline similar to that used aboard Endurance and on the drifting floes. They had to continue behaving like men, expecting rescue, even when the horizon offered no evidence that rescue was coming. The final opportunity came through Chile. The small steam tug Yelcho, commanded by Captain Luis Pardo, carried Shackleton south for another attempt. The vessel was not a specialized icebreaker, which made the operation dependent on timing, weather, and the condition of the pack. On August 30th, 1916, the Yelcho approached Elephant Island through an opening that earlier vessels had been unable to use. The men at Point Wild saw a ship offshore and understood that the long chain of decisions had finally reached them. All 22 members of the shore party were taken aboard. Combined with the 6 who had sailed in the James Caird, all 28 members of the Endurance party had survived. Their rescue did not transform the original expedition into a geographic success. Shackleton never began the planned transcontinental crossing. Endurance was lost, and the carefully organized objective of the Weddell Sea Party failed. The reason their survival appeared almost impossible was not one isolated danger, but the way every danger removed another layer of protection. The Weddell Sea trapped the ship before the continental crossing could begin. The drifting pack carried the expedition beyond its intended route. The Antarctic winter reduced light, warmth, and freedom of movement. Ice pressure destroyed endurance and forced 28 men to live on a surface that could split beneath them. Limited food, damp clothing, weak shelters, changing drift, and the absence of radio contact made waiting increasingly dangerous. When the ice finally opened, they did not sail towards safety in a proper ship. They entered freezing seas in 3 crowded lifeboats. Reaching Elephant Island placed solid ground beneath them, but it also revealed that no one knew where they were. The James Caird voyage was therefore not an optional act of courage added after survival had already been secured. It was the only practical bridge between the stranded crew and the outside world. Worsley's navigation made that bridge possible. Shackleton's leadership kept the men capable of crossing it, and the work of every sailor aboard the boat kept it from collapsing. Even reaching South Georgia did not complete the rescue, because the boat landed on the uninhabited side of the island. The mountain crossing was not a separate adventure. It was the final landward extension of the same rescue route. Only after Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean reached Stromness could ships begin attempting to return through the ice. Each stage existed because the previous stage had failed to provide complete safety, and each success preserved only enough hope to attempt the next one. Shackleton repeatedly reduced the mission to what circumstances still allowed, placing the lives of his men above the geographic achievement that had brought them south. Worsley's records and navigation turned uncertain movement into usable direction. Wild preserved the Elephant Island party during months without news. McNish adapted the James Caird for an ocean passage. Crean and the other sailors supplied practical strength, skill, and cooperation. The expedition became a symbol of leadership under failure because its central achievement appeared only after its original purpose had disappeared. It became a symbol of survival against isolation because the men preserved organization while separated from every ordinary system of assistance. The ice had taken their route, their schedule, and their ship, but through navigation, endurance, fairness, teamwork, and repeated decisions made under uncertainty, it did not take a single member of the Endurance party. When Yelcho carried the men away from Elephant Island on August 30th, 1916, the most immediate question had been answered. The Endurance party was no longer divided between a remote shore and the outside world. Every one of the 28 men who had sailed into the Weddell Sea aboard Endurance had survived the loss of the ship, the months on drifting ice, the open boat journey, and the long wait for rescue. Yet the historical meaning of their experience was far less simple than the rescue itself. The Imperial Transantarctic Expedition had been created to achieve the first crossing of the Antarctic continent. Shackleton's party never reached the intended landing site, never began the crossing, and never completed the geographic objective used to justify the voyage. In the conventional language of exploration, the expedition had failed. The ship was gone, The route had not been traveled, and the carefully prepared plan had been defeated before its central stage could begin. At the same time, the failure produced a survival achievement that eventually became more famous than many successful expeditions. That contradiction explains why endurance remains both admired and debated. It is remembered as a story of leadership, navigation, cooperation, and recovery, but it also raises questions about ambition, risk, decision-making, and the way societies transform difficult history into legend. When the survivors returned to a world shaped by the First World War, their story did not immediately occupy the place it would later hold in popular memory. Europe had experienced suffering on a scale that made even an extraordinary polar ordeal appear distant from the central crisis of the time. Many members of the expedition soon entered military or public service. Their return was not followed by a simple period of celebration in which the entire world immediately agreed on the meaning of what had happened. The historical reputation of the expedition developed gradually through books, lectures, photographs, diaries, navigational records, newspaper accounts, and later documentaries. Frank Hurley's images became especially powerful because they gave later audiences a visual record of endurance surrounded by ice, the crew living aboard the ship, the damaged vessel under pressure, and the men adapting to conditions far beyond the original plan. Those photographs helped transform a remote event into a human story that viewers could imagine. They also contributed to the creation of a memorable visual legend, one in which a wooden ship stood against an overwhelming frozen landscape, and a small group of men remained organized while the world around them disappeared. Shackleton's reputation grew as the expedition was re-examined. He came to represent a form of leadership centered on adaptability rather than rigid commitment to the original objective. Once Endurance could no longer reach the Antarctic coast, he did not continue sacrificing resources to preserve a plan that circumstances had made impossible. When the ship was damaged beyond recovery, he changed the mission. When overland travel across the pack consumed too much strength, he stopped. When Elephant Island offered land, but no realistic expectation of discovery, he chose to seek help. When the first rescue vessel could not penetrate the ice, he tried again. This pattern later attracted the attention of leadership scholars because it demonstrated how an effective leader may need to redefine success during a crisis. The lesson was not that confidence alone could defeat nature. Shackleton could not open the Weddell Sea, repair Endurance after the ice had overwhelmed her, or guarantee that the James Caird would reach South Georgia. His influence operated within limits. He organized people, controlled priorities, protected morale, and made decisions about when to wait and when to act. The distinction matters because later retellings sometimes risk turning him into a figure who personally solved every problem. The evidence shows a more complex achievement. Shackleton led an unusually capable group whose survival depended on many individuals performing specialized tasks under sustained pressure. Captain Frank Worsley's legacy is central to that broader interpretation. His navigational work began long before the James Caird voyage. While Endurance drifted with the pack, he maintained records that allowed the expedition to understand its movement through the Weddell Sea. During the lifeboat journey, he helped guide 3 crowded vessels toward Elephant Island. During the crossing to South Georgia, he used rare observations, dead reckoning, experience, and judgment to locate a small island across roughly 800 miles of unstable ocean. The accuracy required was remarkable because a major error could have carried the boat beyond its destination. Yet Worsley's contribution was not a solitary act performed in isolation from the rest of the crew. His calculations mattered because other men kept the boat functioning. They handled sails, removed water, protected equipment, repaired damage, prepared food, maintained watches, and continued working despite cold and exhaustion. Maritime navigation became the intellectual path to South Georgia, but teamwork kept that path open long enough to reach land. The same pattern appeared throughout the expedition. Frank Wild's leadership sustained the 22 men left on Elephant Island. Harry McNish's carpentry helped adapt the James Caird for the Southern Ocean. Tom Crean's experience and endurance contributed to the crossing of South Georgia. Sailors, engineers, scientists, physicians, dog handlers, and other members of the party maintained the routines and practical systems that prevented the group from becoming disorganized. The rescue therefore belongs to the entire crew. Shackleton and Worsley remain the most visible figures because their responsibilities place them at the center of major decisions. But their success rested on a collective structure. Remembering only the expedition leader can hide the very principle that made survival possible. No single person could perform every necessary task. In British exploration memory, endurance became connected to the traditions of the heroic age, when national identity, scientific curiosity, personal ambition, and public fascination encouraged journeys into polar regions. Shackleton was a figure of the British imperial world, but his Irish birth and family background also gave him a distinct place in Irish historical memory. Later audiences in Britain and Ireland could both recognize elements of his identity, although interpretations varied according to political, cultural, and historical context. His story was not owned entirely by one national tradition. It belonged to a period when identities within the British Isles were layered and when polar expeditions were supported, staffed, and remembered across national boundaries. Worsley's New Zealand background further demonstrated the international character of the expedition. The crew included men from different places, professions, and social positions, united less by a single local identity than by the demands of the voyage. This international dimension helped the story travel beyond Britain and Ireland. It became part of global Antarctic history rather than remaining only a national adventure. In survival psychology, the endurance experience is often examined for its use of routine, fairness, shared hardship, humor, manageable goals, and emotional observation. The men did not survive merely because they possessed strong bodies or warm clothing. Their physical resources steadily declined. Equipment wore out, food required increasing control, sleeping conditions deteriorated, and uncertainty continued for months. Psychological collapse could have weakened the group before material shortages became final. Shackleton's attention to personality and morale helped reduce that risk, but the crew members also sustained one another through companionship and practical cooperation. Games, music, conversation, jokes, duties, and celebrations might seem secondary beside navigation and rationing, yet they protected the group from becoming defined entirely by fear. The expedition showed that morale was not an accidental product of good fortune. It could be supported deliberately through organization and shared purpose. At the same time, historians must be cautious about turning these methods into a simple formula that guarantees survival. The men also benefited from experience, equipment, stored food, favorable moments in the weather, and opportunities that could easily have failed to appear. Leadership improved their chances, but it did not eliminate luck. The discovery of navigable water, the successful landing on Elephant Island, brief opportunities for Worsley to observe the sun, the arrival at South Georgia, and the opening that allowed Yelcho to reach the stranded party were all events that human discipline could use, but not command. This balance between preparation and fortune is part of the story's lasting power. The rescue was neither a miracle without explanation nor an inevitable result of superior leadership. It emerged from skill, judgment, cooperation, endurance, and circumstances aligning just enough for the next stage to remain possible. The expedition also changed public understanding of failure. Exploration stories had often been judged by flags planted, distances crossed, scientific results collected, or routes completed. Endurance offered a different measure. Its original purpose was not achieved, yet the decision to abandon that purpose became essential to saving the crew. This does not mean every failed expedition should be celebrated simply because some members survived, nor does it erase questions about whether the journey should have entered the Weddell Sea when local warnings suggested difficult ice. It means that historical judgment can recognize more than one outcome at the same time. Shackleton's plan failed geographically. His crisis leadership succeeded humanly. Worsley did not navigate the ship to the intended landing place, but he later performed the navigation that made rescue possible. The expedition lost its most visible symbol, endurance, but preserved its people. That tension prevents the story from becoming a simple tale of conquest. Nature was not conquered. Antarctica remained beyond their control. The men survived by adapting to limits rather than defeating them. Later generations found this especially meaningful because it offered a model of leadership that did not depend on pretending. Failure had never occurred. The leader's task became recognizing reality early enough to change direction. The crew's task became accepting new goals without allowing disappointment to destroy cooperation. The result was not the triumph originally advertised, but it was a profound demonstration of responsibility. That is why this history must be explained carefully rather than reduced to the simple claim that one famous explorer saved everyone through courage alone. The 28 members of the Endurance Party survived because leadership, navigation, preparation, discipline, cooperation, specialized skill, and favorable moments in the environment formed an unbroken chain. Shackleton recognized when the original goal had become impossible and redefined success as bringing his men home. Worsley transformed rare observations of the sun, uncertain horizons, current, wind, and dead reckoning into a route across an ocean where missing South Georgia could have ended the rescue. Frank Wild preserved order among the 22 men left on Elephant Island. Harry McNish helped turn a lifeboat into a vessel capable of crossing the Southern Ocean. Tom Crean and the rest of the crew supplied the labor, endurance, and trust that allowed every major decision to work. For American viewers, the story remains relevant because it challenges the familiar idea that success means completing the original mission at any cost. The expedition failed to cross Antarctica, but its leaders accepted that failure before ambition consumed the people placed in their care. They replaced a lost objective with a human responsibility, then pursued that responsibility through months of uncertainty and repeated setbacks. The Weddell Sea trapped them because moving pack ice took control of their ship. Their survival appeared impossible because the ice later took the ship itself, leaving them without communication, stable shelter, or a direct route home. The James Caird voyage and the crossing of South Georgia became the true payoff because those journeys converted endurance into rescue. Endurance never delivered its crew to the beginning of the continental crossing, but the discipline established. Aboard the ship, the patience learned on the ice, the navigation practiced through uncertainty, and the trust maintained among the men ultimately delivered every member of the Endurance Party back from isolation. The expedition did not conquer Antarctica. Its lasting achievement was recognizing that when a mission becomes impossible, the highest form of leadership may be abandoning the dream in time to save the people who trusted you to pursue it.